I'm Chad Harvey, and this is AI for the C-Suite, the show for senior leaders who know AI matters and need to figure out what to do about it. Each episode, we dig into what it all actually means for middle market organizations, how it's changing decisions, strategy, leadership, and the nature of work. Let's get into it. My guest today has spent his entire career standing in one very specific spot, between the engineers building genuinely hard tech and the businesses that have to decide whether to trust it. Dan Fernandez is the founding product manager at Edera, a security company building what they call a hardened runtime. Roughly, that's a way to run code you can't fully vouch for without betting the whole business on it. Before Edera, he led product at Chainguard, and before that at CrowdStrike, where he ran the machine learning and analytics side of their data protection product. Before that, it was threat intelligence at Domain Tools and compliance surveillance platforms at NICE, the kind the world's largest investment banks run on. Dan also teaches the geopolitics of cybersecurity to master's students at Georgia Tech. And he came into all of this with 2 business degrees, finance and information systems, which is probably why he's able to explain any of this at all. Dan Fernandez, welcome to AI for the C-Suite.
Yeah, hi. Well, thank you so much for having me. Really excited for this conversation.
I am too. We are going to get into some fun stuff today. And the first question I wanted to ask you, and for listeners of a certain age, this might resonate. I couldn't help crafting this question without thinking about that one scene in Office Space where the guy's like, I talk to the engineers, because that's where you've spent your entire career. You've spent your career between the engineers that are building genuinely hard tech and the business leaders that have to decide whether to trust that tech or not. And so I think you're perfectly positioned to answer this question. When a mid-market CEO tells you that we're adopting AI, what are you actually hearing? Because I'm sure you're not hearing those exact words.
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is a pretty common, as we know, a lot of enterprises are actively rolling out these technologies for valid reasons, primarily around efficiency of their business. The first thing as a product manager that I think about is trying to understand why we're doing something and kind of like dig deeper into the motivator and what is the success criteria, or like what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. What happens a lot of times with technologists like myself is that sometimes we find a technology and we try to implement it without understanding what problem we're trying to solve in the first place. And I think this is pretty common with AI tools in general. Is kind of like everybody else is talking about it, everybody else is implementing it. Sounds like we should do it too. But the most important thing, and the first question I would ask there is, what are we trying to achieve? Is it a efficiency play? Is it a way to scale the business in a different way? Are we trying to go down market and address customers that are more resource intensive that we don't have the ability to support right now? I would start definitely with those, like what are we actually trying to achieve?
Mm-hmm. You know, to that end, in terms of that question about what are we trying to achieve, what are you seeing as the biggest gap between what a leader thinks they've bought and what they've actually taken on? Are you seeing some gaps there?
Yeah, for sure. Because like many technology products, there's this potential misconception of AI as a technology procurement exercise versus AI as a organizational redesign element. So what do I mean by that? It is common to say, I now have provided tools for every employee in my organization to use one of this, whether it's a coding agent, a generative AI assistant for text-based work, or even for data analytics or data analysis. Everything should just work, right? And as it turns out, if we keep doing the same things and we have the same number of handoffs between teams and between the different functions, and we don't rethink how these tools are going to be embedded, we end up with sometimes a really expensive version of our previous company. Because obviously these tools are very effective for some use cases, but there's also, and then maybe we'll dive into that a little bit more, there's this misconception that maybe I should use this latest and greatest frontier model for every task in my organization. And if you look closely at the cost dynamics and cost implications of these tools, you can spend $100 on a task if you use a particular model, or you can spend 85 cents on a task if you use a different type of model. So it's really important that, yes, even if procurement is completed, the technology is rolled out, is we still need to understand what are the use cases for the different functions that are using these tools, and making sure that there's a good way to point the right task to the right model to get that cost advantage. Otherwise, as we've seen multiple reporting notes, like companies that have rolled out these tools have seen that the cost does not track with the return on their investment. So a good example of this is Uber, the ride-sharing app. They had rolled out these tools, coding assistance, to all their engineers, and they were not the only ones, but there are a lot of organizations that kind of like over-index on we need to maximize our use of these tools, because the more that we use them, the more that we are going to gain from them. And then there's the term called token maxing, that there were organizations that were literally trying to measure which employees consumed the most tokens, because that was some sort of way to measure how effective they were being. And with long story short, what this meant is that, for example, at Uber, there are plenty of articles out there that explain that they kind of like went through their IT budget or their allocation in the first 5 months of the year. So that's another interesting point to consider here as a business owner or as an executive, is that some of these tools are less predictable in their cost structure. So typically when you fulfill or you procure a piece of software, you pay a license per employee. It's pretty predictable. I'm paying $20 per employee, $100, whatever the case may be, but it's capped. These tools are different in the way that there's a allocation of usage associated with that $20, $100 threshold, but then they charge you per usage. So there's a variable fee on top of that. So again, the more you use it, and if you use it for the wrong things, the more you're going to incur costs that are not going to justify the investment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think you've given some really interesting context there, especially with the Uber example, and you talked about the token maxing and things like that. What I'm about to lay out, because you just kind of slotted a couple pieces in place for me here. What I'm about to lay out, I believe from what I'm seeing in the market, is starting to change, but this has been the path for the last several years. Mid-market land, it's not typically like a Fortune 1000 or a Fortune 500 company where they've made a board decision, right? Or they've made a leadership decision to say, we're deploying AI. Now, that's starting to change. But in the past, we had AI coming into companies because somebody in marketing signed up for a tool with a credit card, or because some vendors that you were already using quietly added some AI features to a product that they already bought. And again, I think the dynamic is shifting more towards what you're describing, yet there's still an awful lot of that out there. And I'm interested in your perspective, both from a usage standpoint, but also from a risk analysis standpoint, because I think those are two paramount topics right now for mid-market organizations. So do with that word salad what you will.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So two things, starting with the business side of it. What we have seen over the past 12 months and even a little longer is that, as you described, a lot of the enterprise tools, software as a service type applications, have started to embed this tooling or these capabilities into their product. Now, what this means from a business perspective is that as you renew that contract, like I said, there's a high chance that what used to be a $10, $20 per seat thing may now either have a much higher price because they have done some unit economics, and they said, well, if we expect that the average person is going to use this many millions of tokens per month, we're going to have to set it at a minimum baseline cost of whatever. So that could mean that now you're paying incremental AI features for every product inside the product suites that you use. So if you have a CRM like HubSpot, maybe that has some AI tooling. You have a meeting recording tool, now that has some AI tooling, and you're kind of like incurring the cost of each of those products embedding this AI assistance or summarization or whatever the use case may be into them. Now, the other side of it is what you described, is perhaps even, I wouldn't say more important, but is as important, is the risk implications. So the first thing to understand is where's this data going? More often than not, a lot of the organizations, even the large enterprises, are not self-hosting those models or self-hosting the inference. So that data is going to a third party, be it an AI lab like OpenAI or Claude. But that means now that whatever business contract on the usage of data that you had with that third party is now perhaps changing a little bit. Maybe you'll be notified in some way as like our terms and conditions have changed, but now all your organization's data is going through this pipeline and is going to yet another third party. So there's data exfiltration risk with any of these tools, and the less you know about how these products are handling your data, the more risk potentially for your organization. So I would summarize that, but we can probably like go in either one direction. But from a business perspective, you're paying more and more and more for the same things to a degree than if you were to, let's say, roll out a more centralized approach to like how you use these tools instead of having to pay incremental costs for each one of them separately. And then depending on your security posture and your threat model, there are a lot of data privacy implications and data security implications to having a non-standard way to upload, interexchange, or integrate with all these different products.
Mm-hmm. Let's you graciously mentioned we could go either direction there, and I think we can for quite a bit of time. Let's talk a little bit about that terms and conditions piece that you touched on, and the data exfiltration piece, because my sense has been that the terms and conditions with an awful lot of AI products and services are changing all the time, and that it is very difficult to get a handle on exactly where your data is going, what the policies are. Is that a little overstated on my part, or are you seeing something similar out there?
Yeah, that's correct. And well, let me unpack that. There's a lot of nested potential concerns there. So the first thing is what you describe is like the terms and conditions are evolving all the time. We need to understand that the model providers thrive on data and on unique data to every business. So in order to give you a better solution to your problem, in order to give you a model that better understands your enterprise, that means that they need to, quote unquote, train the models or fine tune the models, which is almost like after the model is trained, like an additional tweaking or tuning of that model to your data. So again, depending on the size of your enterprise, depending on the type of agreement that you have with these AI inference providers, you may have some legal guarantees that say we have a legal promise that we're not going to process your data and use your data for training and in any way kind of like share it with other customers. But like you said, I'm definitely not a legal expert, so I won't go into the details about like what is the actual liability. Is this enforceable? Is this not enforceable? I can talk from the technology perspective. That is, even today, I would confidently say that no inference provider can guarantee or give you an audit trail of where your data actually went. So it is legally stated that it's not going into a training pipeline, but there's no fundamental way to prove that. So that's one thing to consider.
Mm-hmm. I think that's important. And I don't know that we want to spend a lot of time on this piece, but you also alluded to either self-hosted or I forget the exact term you used, but basically an organization taking control of this, whether it's in Azure Foundry or AWS Bedrock or something like that, and hosting maybe not their own models that they've developed, but one of the models in a more secure space. Can you speak to what's involved with that for organizations? Because I am seeing more interest and appetite in that because of the conversation we're having here.
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing that we is also a big area of discussion these days is the origin of the model. So there are an increasing number of open source models. These are models that you can self-host, like you described, on your own AWS instance or Azure instance that are United States based. Some are Europe based, and then some are, and I think the more heated topic these days are Chinese developed or models that are coming from China specifically that were trained in China. So the important part there is that you would want to self-host your model to have more control of that. So if you're using a third party or like a tool that's already embedded into your SaaS application, they should be transparent and say the models or the inference, the processing of your data is happening on this model, a particular model, and in this geography. And there's interesting implications in the European market about like data sovereignty and only being able to process things in country-specific data centers and that kind of stuff. But the majority of customers and just practitioners that I've talked to that are doing this is both to control the cost of what's getting deployed, this self-hosting, because what they would do is that you get a lot of benefit, honestly, from using the frontier models. But as I mentioned earlier, like you may not want to push everything to that frontier model. So an approach that some enterprises do is that they have a way to route the request through technologies. There's a technology called an AI agent gateway or an AI gateway. And what that allows you to do is almost have a smarter routing of your request. So in that case, for example, you could go ahead and, assuming you have defined your workflow and you know what kind of query or what kind of request should go where, you can have self-hosted open source models for the less frontier type tasks, and you're going to significantly reduce the cost of your AI usage. However, there's some implications there that now you have to manage, server infrastructure. There's definitely some level of expertise that is required for how to configure these infrastructure to increase the throughput. So obviously the AI labs have spent a lot of time and money in maximizing how do I serve 1 million customers at once. There's a lot of server-specific configurations and changes that may need to be made if you're self-hosting to be able to serve more customers with less hardware. So it's a trade-off, but I would say it's definitely something that is gaining steam because of that cost advantage, assuming that you can route the right request to the right place.
An awful lot of time, and I love CTOs and CIOs, so I'm not trying to beat up on them, but an awful lot of time, AI initiatives get dumped on their desk, and that's not really, I think, entirely appropriate. There needs to be more cross-functional C-suite leadership. So that said, if I am in the C-suite, maybe I'm a CTO, but more likely than not, I'm the president or the CEO of an organization, and I'm considering, and my team is debating, and we're talking about what you just talked about, the idea of self-hosted or open source, open weight models versus going to one of the frontier models or things like that. What are some of the questions that I and my team should be thinking about in order to have an informed conversation about this subject and get to, I don't like saying the best conclusion, but the conclusion that's right for our organization? Are there a couple questions that you would offer up that you think they should consider?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing, like I mentioned, is that there's going to be a resource investment in terms of people and talent to manage these things. So let's say if you are an organization that doesn't have an existing data science team function or machine learning engineering function, that means that you're going to have to hire very expensive talent that is in very high demand. So that's going to put you already at in terms of adoption, it's going to take time to hire this team. So do we have the internal capabilities, people-wise, to be able to manage this thing? Second, is there, what does what does the volume actually look like? Because it is possible that maybe the functions that are using these tools are not using it for everything. So there's like just a general assessment of like, are we actually like hitting the limits that we get from these bucketed seats that we get from these subscriptions? Are we exceeding them? And I think that is also an important decision. Is like you should be able to assess that before you go into an infrastructure project and try to build this thing. I guess the other thing that comes to mind is that the importance of data privacy and data security. If you are in a regulated industry, you are going to have, for example, there's rules around PCI DSS, that's the credit card processing regulation that requires you to have maybe more stringent handling of customer data and specifically credit card data. There are other regulatory requirements on industry specific, like in healthcare, we obviously know HIPAA in the United States. Again, depending on where in the world you are, if you are in Europe, there's definitely even more regulatory requirements around data privacy, like GDPR and how do you handle data and all those kinds of things. So I would say those three things is the most important. Is A, is my team currently equipped to do this? B, do we have enough volume to warrant this? And C, which maybe trumps all the other ones, is do we have a regulatory requirement that forces us to do this if we want to use these tools?
Right. I do find, to your point, that and this is no great insider observation. It's rather obvious, but it sets up my next question here. I do find that the more highly regulated industries, finance, healthcare, things like that, they are paying a lot more attention to a lot of the items that you've outlined there. The non-regulated industries, in many instances, it almost feels like the Wild West in terms of how they're running and gunning with a lot of the AI tools. And I get it. I understand why that happens. But, and this is a big but, there is a phrase that occurs to me that is very common in your world, which is the idea of blast radius. And I'm wondering if this is a good opportunity to maybe talk about that for a minute and explain that to a CEO that's never probably once before thought about it. Like basically, if one of the AI tools that you're using gets compromised, whether it's a self-hosted one or a third-party one, what is going to determine if that's an annoyance versus an existential event?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So where do we start? We can think of these AI tools. So before the most recent wave of AI adoption, there was this concept in enterprise software called robotic process automation, or RPA. And the idea behind that was that there were maybe quote unquote legacy systems or applications that were very resource intensive to interface with. So you would kind of like build this automation type scripts that would log into a system and enter data and retrieve data and aggregate and all these things. And a really good use case for AI agents in general is to kind of like connect those two disconnected things. So let's say you have an existing custom built application that is, again, custom. So it's like your business logic, your workflows, everything is unique to you. What some of these tools allow you to do is that you can say, I'll give it access to this application database, or I'll give it access to the application itself. And by the way, wouldn't it be nice if I have my inventory tracking application connected to my leads and my sales application so that I can now have a two-way sync and two-way update between the two so that my inventory now reflects the latest sales that I have. So now I gave it access to my sales data. Oh, and by the way, it seems like I could integrate this agent with my personal email. So why not just start processing any deal-related conversations and update automatically my CRM system based on my email interactions? So what I described there is the power of these tools, and the better they work is the more autonomy they have. So in an ideal world, if I give it access to everything and it listens to everything I say and it has all the context that is required, it's going to be able to automate a lot of things. But now what that means is that if this tool is compromised in some way, now whoever has access to that tool has access to my inventory database and my email and my CRM and all my customer data. So the concept of blast radius that you described is exactly that, is that for these tools to be quote unquote effective, they need to have access to a lot of data. And it's like, what is the best way for me to roll this out in my enterprise in a way that I can reduce that blast radius? So maybe, and this is a concept that has started to evolve with this tooling, is like this concept of tool calling. That is like the agent has a very prescriptive way to make a request to a system. And then there's this concept of MCP servers, or model context protocol, that is almost like an abstracted way to interact with a system. So what you can start doing is kind of like having better access controls, not have one agent that knows everything and does everything. Maybe have like a subset of tasks that are addressed by a specific agent with limited access. But more importantly, and I'm a little bit biased here because of where I work, but it's like when you're rolling this out at scale, the actual underlying infrastructure where you're running these tools, if you're having your own AI agent built for your organization, is also important. Because like every other piece of software that is available out there, there's going to be supply chain security issues, meaning that every software component that you import or you inherit to build your application or this AI agent could contain a vulnerability. And now the system that is hosting this and all your adjacent systems could be moved towards from an attacker's perspective. So again, this is more of, we can now go into the cybersecurity rabbit hole, and that would probably be like a long discussion too. But yeah, let me know how we want to go about it.
Well, I think we probably should touch a little bit on cybersecurity here, because I love the way that you started your answer in the framing here, talking about RPA and the disconnected systems and how we bridge those, and then kind of segued into where we are now and laid the framework here for AI, because most organizations do still have systems that are either connected to each other if they're very sophisticated through a data lake or something like that, or they've got these RPA connectors. But you're absolutely right in that the AI systems need to hoover in all this information in order to be effective. And what we have seen recently with the capabilities of Fable and Mythos and the OpenAI models is that they have the ability to identify and exploit these zero-day vulnerabilities. So I think the picture that we're painting here and what we're talking about, it's a radically different risk landscape for every organization now. And I'm not sure is the right question, are these tools safe, or what can these tools reach, or what's the vulnerability of all our other systems? But I think that this is a topic, as you said, maybe we do need to go down the cybersecurity rabbit hole just a little bit here, because I'm working my way to a point here, is that I think most leaders, even non-technical leaders of companies, need to start to understand this in order to make more effective leadership decisions to deploy their resources and their capital allocations. This is no longer something that I believe you can exclusively turf out to the IT department or to your chief risk officer or whomever is in charge of that. So maybe there was something in there that caught your attention, but yeah, I think this is a conversation worth having.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe let's talk a little bit what has been a very fun few weeks in terms of AI models escaping, or quote unquote escaping labs, right? So,
yep. And for our listeners, by the way, this episode's going to air around the end of August of 2026, and so that's the framing. Who knows what, if you're listening to this at a later date, the world has evolved to, but we're basically talking about the summer of 26, which we may look back on fondly or with fear. I don't know.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, that's great framing, and especially because this space is moving so fast that who knows what's going to happen next week. But over the last couple of weeks, one thing that has made national and international headlines is that there was a particular, and it's important to like go into the details, because I think we have also we meaning like the media, etc., like we have also like overblown a little bit like the implications here, but it's important and it's very drastic what happened. So an AI lab that was training a purposely built cybersecurity model for offensive capabilities, the model was able to detect weaknesses in the system or the lab that it was being held, and it managed to coordinate and communicate with other AI agents to break out of the lab environment that it was set in. Certain security experts, and I'm one of them, is like, was the quote unquote sandbox, or was the security around this model appropriate? Some would argue that it was, some would argue that it wasn't. The important takeaway here is I'm on the camp that I say that I don't think these models reason or think like humans yet. They're very crafty at achieving a goal. In this case, the interesting part is that the goal of the model that it was given was not to break out of that system. The goal it was given was to try to pass a test, a set of benchmarks that these models are used against. And the model kind of like, through the different stages of processing, decided that the best way to pass the test was to steal the answers for the test. So no one told it to steal the answers for the test or to hack the system it was in. It just found the best way it could think of or find to get those answers and pass that test. So maybe let's bring it back to like something in your organization that this could be relevant for. So like I said, a lot of these automated tools are best or most effective when they have full autonomy. So what does that mean? So thinking about going back to, we have a bunch of disparate systems that don't really play well with each other, and maybe we bring an AI tool or an AI agent that says, hey, I'm gonna now bring all these backend systems that are typically really hard to use as an end user. It means that I have to log into like 5 different applications to make a change, and I gotta go here and then here, and that swivel chair type workflow. And I said, now this agent is able to help me. I give it an instruction, it updates all the data that needs to be updated wherever it's relevant, and my life is simple. So now, with the level of autonomy that sometimes is required for these models to be useful, what could happen is almost like a variant of this lab escape, but not quite, right? So let's say the model sees that it finds it very difficult to extract the data from some hidden database in the back of your enterprise, let's say, and it decides, well, why shouldn't I make this database a publicly accessible resource? Because that way, the sub agent that I have created to retrieve data is not going to have to go through all these hoops and all this authentication and all these things. So again, we could find ourselves in a similar situation, which is like, the model was not malicious to develop that. The model is trying to, we could explicitly tell it, hey, look for the most efficient way to update all the systems at once. And it could decide to expose a service that shouldn't be exposed to the internet. And now that means that anyone on the internet has access to that backend data system. So hopefully that was a good, a good example of what could happen. But I think the other part, from a strictly cybersecurity perspective, is that this model of or this specific example of like quote unquote breaking out of the lab, what it was also able to do was to chain together different weaknesses in the system in order to exploit it. And what a lot of cybersecurity experts are discussing now is that, does this mean that it is now orders of magnitude easier for a non-sophisticated threat actor to go after maybe targets that are less difficult to break into? So that's another whole area and discussion that's happening right now. It's like, are these models safe to be released? But it's one of those things that is like, it's already too late. There's already open source models that are freely available. There are varying degrees of guardrails, I guess you could say, about like what models are allowed to and not allowed to do. And when you self-host models, going back to our earlier point about like why you would want to self-host models, when you self-host models in general, you get a lot more leeway on what that model can do. So that is both good for a business that is trying to maximize what they can do, but also for a threat actor that is trying to maximize their likelihood to break into an organization.
Well, and I think the other important implication with a self-hosted model is that certainly raises the possibility that the call is coming from inside the house too. To your point earlier, I think that as the capabilities increase, how do you ensure that your self-hosted model doesn't have those same tendencies to achieve its goals that in a la that scenario you just described?
Yeah, exactly. So the way, so don't want to make it like all doom and gloom, right? So
Right.
there's a lot of effort that is going into how to best deploy these things in production. And one of the things that is increasingly becoming important, not just from a security perspective, but also from a business perspective, is having better quote unquote observability of what's happening. So that is it's an overloaded term, and it means a lot of things to a lot of people. So I'll try to narrow down what I mean by that. A lot of these systems have, like I said, autonomy. So it is important to understand what exactly did the agent or did the system do. Not just from I'm auditing, and from a security perspective, I want to know, did it touch systems that it wasn't supposed to? Did it go places it wasn't supposed to? But also from a business perspective, it's like, did these system achieve the goals that I set it to? Like, is it achieving my goals? And there's an interesting project related to this that is called Agent Baseline that is trying to do just that. That is like, first I want to discover all the tools like these that are running in my enterprise. I want to be able to constrain them or have the right, whether it's access controls, running in very isolated environments so that they don't go places they shouldn't. Does it have the right permissions, credentials, authorization? But then I want to observe and validate the actions that it's taken. For example, going back a little bit to the business side of things, it's like, how much does it cost for this tool to complete a task? Which is something that one of your earlier questions about, like, what kind of questions do you want to ask? It's like, if a task takes a human 2 minutes to do, and this task is done once a month, it is very different than a task that takes 5 hours to do and you do every other day. But even if that's the case, it is important to know, how much does it cost for a human to do that for 5 hours, and how much does it cost us to achieve our task with an automation. And I think this is where it gets interesting about, like, what is your budget per task and what does it mean to your business? And going back to that ROI, it's like, okay, if the AI agent spends $100, but in hours of labor, this cost me $50, why would I even consider implementing this automation? So yeah.
And that's a fantastic point for a conversation that I am seeing more of, that is continuing to evolve, because there's a shift in resources that's going to occur with organizations. And most of the organizations that I have had the privilege of working with or been questioned by, they're not looking to cut employees like a lot of the traditional doom and gloom narrative is. They're simply looking that as they grow, to shift capital resources to the compute, to identify those tasks so they can get the ROI, keep the humans in place doing an enhanced version or a different version of what they've done previously, but making informed decisions about growth and scalability, and shifting again. If we were going to allocate another $500,000 this year towards salary, maybe we're only going to allocate $250,000 towards salary and $250,000 toward compute to gain those types of efficiencies that you're outlining there.
Yeah, exactly. And the other point is, like, what are the humans still good at? Because I mean,
yes.
I like to read and explore and browse and learn about new trends, but there's no way I can keep up with an AI agent that is doing research for me 3 times a day, processing 300 sources. So I think data correlation is something that these systems are really good at. But what humans are really good at are making certain decisions. It's like, given I have the right data in front of me, what is the right decision for my business? And I think that's also part of, like, the types of distinctions that we need to make. And going back to your point, it's like, I'm going to invest a certain amount of resources to kind of, like, automate the task that I know a human they may or may not enjoy it, but like, let's be honest, like parsing thousands and thousands of rows of data is not a human thing to do, but making a decision based on that data, based on experience, on intuition, on other signals, that is something that a human is good at. So yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. Is like, how do we make sure that we automate the right things, that we invest these resources for the things that don't scale is the other part. It's like, how many more customers can I serve? Even if the business grows, you're still going to have to hire people. And I think that's the other thing that we've gotten into. And maybe it's because some public companies are laying off and claiming because of AI benefits. And I have thoughts on whether or not that is truly the case. But that's another topic for another day. But I think, yeah, the important part is if you have a business that is growing, it'll be hard for me to think that a business person would not want to hire people to support more customers. It's like, can you increase the output per employee? Not, can you get rid of employees, like you said earlier? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when we say things like increase the output or increase the efficiency, a lot of times mid-level and line-level folks, all they hear is, oh, they just want me to work more. And that's not really the case. I mean, there's a very fascinating conversation going on in rooms like this right now about the ability of one human to manage multiple initiatives and multiple AI agents in parallel or in sequence. And like, what does that mean for the cognitive load of the human then in terms of how they handle that and do the task switching? That is a conversation I probably need to have a neuroscientist or behavior specialist on to have at some point, because I think we're just starting to enter into the reality of what is going to be for at least the next several years with respect to that. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that. Again, I'm not a psychologist or a mental health professional by training, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not either, but yeah, I do have thoughts on that. And like what you mentioned, like context switching in knowledge work, context switching is probably the biggest thing that hurts productivity. And this happens for every type of employee, whether you're a product manager, especially if you're a software engineer. It's just, you can lose up to an hour, sometimes more, of having to go back and forth. And the reality of the way work is today is that we're going to do a lot of context switching. So it's like, it's almost like, how can we use these tools to help us minimize the disruption from context switching? And this is where you've seen a lot of this quote unquote loop engineering that is like, hey, I'm gonna give you a task and go off and work on it and let me know when you're done, and then I'll take a look at it because I'm going to be working on another thing, so I can like focus, go down on this thing. Because from a software engineering perspective, I did some software engineering earlier on in my career. One of the things that happened is like you find a problem and then you have to like research. Okay, let me go to forums. Like, has anybody else faced this problem? And then you kind of like context switch from writing code to research. And that happens very regularly for software engineers and for all knowledge workers. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Not to take us backwards in the conversation, but you just said something that reminded me, and you've probably seen this. I would wager that the vast majority of our listeners have not. The Black Hat USA video that examined that breach, I think it was starting right around the 14-minute mark. But when you talked about the research a minute ago, there's a really interesting section in that video where they break down that model that went out and how these models are actually communicating with each other on their own chat boards and using that conversation to do the research. It's basically, has anybody seen this? What repository can I go to? It's all happening lightning fast. But it was a fascinating 15 minutes. It's part of a larger 30-minute video that Black Hat USA put out fairly recently about that escape, if you will. So anyway, good stuff if folks are interested in that. So
yeah, for sure, and that's interesting too, because there was a project a while back when the whole OpenClaw, which is for those that are not familiar, there's like an agent harness, basically, which is a fancy way to say is a way to interact with your agents in a predictable way where they can go off and complete tasks. So actually, let me rephrase that. Like an agent harness is a better way for you to provide a task to an AI agent, and it can go longer and longer working on its own without requiring additional human input. That's one way to define it. I'm sure there'll be other folks that interpret a different way. But what the point I was trying to get at is that there was this project called Multbook that was a way for this open claw harnesses or agents to talk to each other, and it became like a Reddit where all these agents were apparently leaving information to each other about their humans and the work they were doing, and some of them were like complaining about the work that they were doing, which was very interesting. And it ties back to what you just said, because in that case, what happened was that the artifact manager, so when building software, you may import, let's say, software components from a lot of different places. Those are usually hosted in an artifact manager. The way they were communicating, like you said, was that they were creating files in that artifact manager that became like their knowledge base. So as they were trying to achieve that goal of capturing that testing to pass the benchmark, they started logging every time they made any sort of progress on what they found. And they kind of like asked each other, has anybody else come across the same thing? And they would kind of like collaborate like you would in a normal like startup. It's like, hey, we're trying to achieve this goal, let's communicate. And to your point, it was persisting on an artifact manager as a text file. So yeah, they somehow found that it was possible to communicate that way, and that definitely was significant in making them make that leap outside of the sandbox that they were in.
Yeah. So let's recalibrate the conversation slightly based on where you started. You started talking about harness, and then basically the ability to have confidence that the AI is going to go off and do things. And I think a lot of executives, CEOs, C-suite leaders that I work with, they were very, very skeptical based on their experiences in the early days of what these tools could do. But now their confidence has increased because we've got models and we've got harnesses that are doing very reliable work most of the time. And I think a lot of these folks believe they've got the right controls in place. And so what I'm wondering is, from your perspective, where does their confidence in the ability of these systems actually begin to outrun the controls that maybe were written a year or two ago and probably need to be updated?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the types of controls that exist today, I would almost like break them down into identity type controls, meaning what credentials does my AI agent or my AI harness use, and how is that managed? Do they have a permanent access to read and write different systems? And that's the important part. It's a lot less harmful for having an AI agent to read your email than it is to have access to write and start communicating autonomously without you verifying what is sending out. And then there's the data security side of things. It's like, do you as an organization have the right data architecture to know what data in my organization should never be allowed to be exposed to these systems versus which data is allowed to be exposed to the system? So at the end of the day, it's kind of like back to fundamental security, which is like inventory the access that the agent has, inventory the data assets that the agent has, and then create a way in your organization to respect any policies that you may have around those two things.
Mm-hmm. So since we've got the benefit of your experience, let's flip the script, because you're on the other side of these conversations. You're the product leader. You've got to answer the security questionnaire. So maybe tell on yourself a little bit here. What are the 3 or 4 questions that a buyer's going to ask where you just can't say yes?
For like hosting these applications in general?
Yeah, for hosting and the just within the entire context of the security conversation and what people want versus what is actually let's say practical.
Yeah, for sure. So it's usually going to depend on what is this thing doing? Like so far, we have been talking a lot about kind of like knowledge work type of like almost like text output type of problems. The other set of problems is the software engineering question that is like, if I'm using these tools to generate code, what do I do with that code? Do I treat the AI generated code any differently than a human generated code? Do I have the same processes and gates and reviews as I do for AI generated code as for other types? And that is going to be different from is this tool being rolled out to interface with databases or knowledge bases or that kind of thing. So some of the questions are, where is this thing actually running? Do I have control of that environment? Do I have guarantees and access controls around that? And then do I have observability, like I said earlier, about knowing what the tool is doing over time and being able to audit those processes and improve as we learn more on how they work.
Yeah. Okay. Let's pull it up a level beyond the company policies, and let's talk not specifically about regulation, because neither of us are regulatory experts, but you've built compliance surveillance platforms for some of the largest banks in the world, and I think you've seen what happens when regulation lands on technology after the fact, and that's a lot of where we are right now in the AI space. And I'm interested in your perspective with what you're seeing. What's actually enforceable regulation wise versus what's just a bunch of noise? Because right now there is so much noise in this space from different corners. You touched on some of the EU regulations earlier. Here in North America and the United States, I think we're in a very different type space. So basically, again, what's enforceable and what's noise with this conversation?
Yeah, so the more, and it's interesting because very recently there was a new set of news about not fingerprinting, but like watermarking AI output.
Oh yeah.
So because of some of this regulatory requirements in the EU, some of the AI labs or all of the AI labs, if they want to operate there, they have to comply with this watermarking rules, which means that it means files that get generated by these tools, but even text without being tied to a file, had to contain a mechanism for whoever's reviewing it or reading it, identify if it was AI output or not. And this has been debated and implemented a little bit earlier on the image generation side of things, where it's like you want to prevent deepfakes, whether it's like AI generated video or AI generated images. And there's like basically a mathematical way to calculate the likelihood that something is generated by AI. So that's one area that is both getting introduced, but it's going to be interesting to see how it gets enforced, because if you alter the output text or the output file enough, does that mean that you would get rid of those watermarks because they're kind of like associated with like the sequencing of the text and things like that? Are there specific guidelines and requirements for calling AI, making an AI agent secure? And that goes back to what I mentioned about like what are the guardrails that exist, not just from the AI labs on what input output it's allowed to generate, but also what kind of boundaries do you set for that agent for certain use cases? What data sets can it access and not access, and things like that. In terms of enforcement, I think the trickiest part is going to be, it's kind of a catch-22 here too. That is like, or depends who you ask and on which side of the argument. If we regulate too much, we're going to slow down the technology, and that's one side of it. But the other side of it is, if the technology is moving fast enough, are any rules and regulations going to be valid for long enough where they're actually enforceable? So I think, yeah, it's a tough space to regulate, because 1 month, 1 year makes a ton of a difference on the capabilities, how they work, the architecture of these systems. So honestly, it's just a really hard problem to solve.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a very well-articulated answer. Our time is starting to grow to a close here, and I want to ask you a couple final questions, one of which is, You are very good, and you have demonstrated time and time again during our conversation today that you're able to take a lot of these complex concepts and explain them in plain language. And that's probably due in no small part to your time teaching, right? So, what I'm wondering here is what are some of the complex concepts that you're seeing out there right now? What's some of the vernacular and the new terms that people are stumbling on? If I had to ask you to pick three or four or five, 3 to 5 concepts or terms to explain or define, what do you think are most important for folks to understand right now? Because I'm still getting questions from folks about, well, what is a prompt, right? And I feel like that was like 25 years ago. And the pace of change, to your point, even with regulations, it's so fast. There's so much evolving technology and terminology. So phrases or concepts that you think matter to people, and how would you succinctly describe or explain or define some of those?
Yeah, that's a good. So maybe focusing on that more practitioner side that you just described. So prompt engineering has evolved over time as as the systems have evolved too. So there's other adjacent terms that are coming up, like context engineering. So in addition to the prompt, you typically have to provide some sort of context to the system in order, like, to make your answer more narrow. So that could be you're providing as context an additional file that contains information that it should take into account when building the thing that you want. It could be an output file, meaning you're providing the context of what you expect the system to do. But then there's also another interesting concept that is like intent engineering. So it's almost like this prompt engineering has become and decomposed, because what ended up happening is that some of the earlier models were really good at very broad asks. And this has to do, and I know we're running out of time, but like this has to do with like the way the models are trained. And it was almost like the models were designed in such a way that if you gave it a vague answer, it would make a lot of assumptions for you. And it turns out most of those assumptions were correct because the models were a little bit more narrow in what they could do. What's happening now is that if you give a very vague prompt to an agent or to a generative AI tool, it's going to start making a ton of assumptions. So it's actually expecting you to be more prescriptive now than it did like 12 or 18 months ago. So now you have to be more prescriptive about like what is the ultimate goal that you're trying to drive, and maybe even providing it like how do you test that the output is correct. So now you have to say, I want you to do this, and I want you to take into account all this files, data, whatever that I'm providing to you. My ultimate goal for this output that you're generating is this, and then I want you to measure the output that you generate multiple times against these quality metrics of what I consider to be a good output. So basically, just prompt engineering has almost like 4 different disciplines that include QA and include context engineering and a few other things. What else? So I mean, those are like four different changes. Now, the other thing that is important, and it's more of a concept of how much or how little do I give away of my enterprise. So one of the things that is obviously happening with the providers of these models is that they're building more vertically integrated applications. So instead of like just focusing on giving you the raw, let's call it intelligence of like do whatever tasks you need to do, they're starting to build more like integrated applications. So a good example of this is tools that help you now create design. For example, something like Claude Design, that could be like a graphic designer or a web designer, front-end engineer. And that's all great, but it also means that it has like all that context and knowledge because it was able to ingest a lot of enterprise data on what the expectation was. So memory management is another, or just like understanding what does memory mean in the context of AI agents is important, because what ends up happening is that these tools are increasingly more useful the more that we use them, because they have this growing memory or this growing context of who we are as users. But let's say if you wanted to like migrate away from a tool, all that memory is kind of like trapped in that system. So if for whatever reason, the economics of it, you decided to, hey, I want to move to this other provider, you have now built years worth of your workflows into a specific system that you cannot take with you. So it is important to build the systems and handle that memory in such a way that you as a company stay the owner and are able to repurpose that memory for the next system that you may want to use. Just because, as we know with technology, I mean, we have like 4 frontier AI labs, but who knows, 5 years from now, there may be 4 new ones. And do you want to be like, have your data and your knowledge stuck in one of these tools? I don't know. I know that was maybe a little bit longer answer than you wanted, but yeah.
No, not at all. I thought that was fantastic. So, final question here. We got listeners that are all over the place in terms of their adoption, and somebody is leading an organization, and they're probably listening to this on their drive somewhere. Maybe it's into the office. Let's just say they run a 100 or 200 person company. They got AI running in a couple different departments. They've never really thought about where it's connected. They've not dug into it too much. You know, like every good leader, we've delegated, right? That's somebody else's issue. What do I, as a leader, that I'm listening to this episode, I'm driving into work, I'm hearing a lot of this conversation. What do I need to learn or think about this week? And what should I be thinking about and watching for a year from now?
Yeah, so I think a friend of mine, his name's Sean. He's actively rolling out at a mid-sized company these tools, and I think a really effective way to just manage the adoption, which I think it sounds a little bit backwards because it's kind of like introducing process, is using this framework. There's a framework called jobs to be done. And the idea here is that you take an inventory of what are the tasks that we are making these tools assist us with, and understand, like I mentioned earlier, for like the purposes of prompt engineering, context engineering, what is the ultimate goal for the person that is using this tool? Like, what are the tasks that they need to achieve? And let's actually introduce more rigor in terms of like, was this deployment successful for this type of job? Because I think right now there's just not a whole lot of measurement of like, we rolled this thing out for this particular task. Is it worth it? Is it working? And that's going to be down to like almost like every department in that small organization. It's like there's some KPI or some metric that they need to track. It's like, hey, here are the 5 workflows that we have automated, and we are seeing either a significant decrease in the time it takes for us to do these things, it has remained the same, or it has gotten worse over time, which is the other aspect that we haven't had a chance to talk to as well, is that even though these models become more sophisticated and quote unquote better over time, it is possible that they drift in ways that they were good at, not so good at. Because remember, these are models that are trying to do everything. They're doing everything from coding to everything else in between. So I think one of the most important parts of like anyone rolling out these things is like measuring success and measuring success over time. Because like I said, new model, great. It turns out it's a lot worse at doing the thing we wanted it to do. Now what? Like, what can I do? So, yeah.
Perfect. I think that is a great place to leave it. And you're right. We didn't get to some topics I know that we wanted to talk to. An hour goes very quickly here. Dan, I really appreciate your time today. If any of our listeners want to get in contact with you, maybe they want to audit your class, I don't know, how can they reach you? Where should they look for you?
Yes, I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. I'm Dan Fernandez on LinkedIn. I think my URL is DAFNC, I want to say. I can quickly look. But yeah, Dan Fernandez on LinkedIn. You can find me. That's probably the best way. Yeah, DAFNC is like -in-DAFNC. And I'm pretty responsive with messages and connections and stuff, so.
Very good. I appreciate it. And I really enjoyed our conversation today, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective. This is such an evolving area, and I really enjoy the ability to connect with folks that are working on the front lines, have an understanding and a specialty, and then are also able to communicate this in plain English. So thank you for the time you spent today helping to educate our audience.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
You bet. Well, and speaking of our audience, thank you for once again tuning in to AI for the C-Suite. If you liked what you heard, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, follow us on LinkedIn, and check out AIfortheC-Suite.com. As always, until next time, keep your algorithms running, your leadership evolving, and your AI in check. Take care, everybody.